This is the session on pricing and Azure opportunity, specifically for you, for MSPs. And we're joined with Will Ominsky. Will and I have never met, so Will, it's our first time. We've had a great relationship with Nerdio, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say. As Will said, feel free to chime in on the chat if you have any questions. Will probably stop a little bit during the course of his presentation and ask if you have anything, but he will try and address your questions as we go. And certainly we have time for Q&A at the end. So Will, I'm going to turn it over to you. I'll mute myself unless you need me for anything.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And just a heads up too, I am horrible at multitasking when I'm presenting. So if you are typing stuff in the chat, I may not see it, but I will try and pause at certain spots to make sure that they can be asked and I can review them. So just if I'm not instantaneous on answering your question, that is why. So I'm just going to dive right in. We all know why we're here, determining the cost of Azure from an MSP perspective. And I really like to start out with, well, why do we even have to have a class on this, right? Why do we even need to take time out of our day to figure this out? What is the challenge we're trying to solve? And I think as we were talking about before we got started here, one of the most challenging aspects of building out an Azure practice as an MSP is packaging and pricing, right? We all know and have heard maybe some misconceptions about Azure. We all look at Azure as this variable cost world, and our customers and even us as MSPs are used to transacting many things in a fixed cost model. So how can I fundamentally change the entire way that I do business and go out and sell this to my end customer when the alternative is spend $5 grand on a server versus, hey, well, it depends how often you use this server that's in the great cloud. It might be more one month and it might be less another. So that can be pretty difficult. And then ultimately, what this drills down to as well is, how can you achieve the highest margin possible while also providing a very competitive price to your end customer? I think a lot of times when MSPs start thinking about incorporating Azure into their practice, one of the first things you do is you go find the Azure pricing calculator. And you say, hey, I'm pricing out this server, this physical replacement server. Let's see what Azure might cost. You pull up a server in Azure, there's all these different options. You kind of make your best guess. And you look at the price and you say, this is crazy. How could I possibly sell this to my customer and add some margin? So these are the things that I want to address today to empower you to be able to go out there and price out Azure. So where I start in the very first step is gathering the information. Right? We can't actually accurately price out Azure, keep our margins high, keep our costs really low, unless we know everything possible about the end customer, the environment that we want to build. I'm not going to read through every one of these. You guys are all probably gathering a lot of this information today. However, there are some key specific things that, especially if you're doing Windows Virtual Desktop in Azure, that are different or you need to understand more in depth. And I'll highlight those. So user habits. What are the users doing? In a lot of cases, when we do on-prem refreshes, we just buy as much as we can afford, right? As much RAM, as much CPU, latest processor, that type of stuff. But with Azure, to kind of hit those goals that we're trying to achieve, we got to understand a little bit deeper user habits, right? Things like, do they do graphic intensive programs? How many tabs of their favorite web browser do they have open? Is it normally 10 or do they have 100, right? I know I end to look at the end of the day and I maybe have 50 tabs open, but those things are really important because each tab consumes a whole bunch of RAM. And we want to make sure we're balancing really great cost as well as really great performance, which is easily achievable in Azure. Concurrent users is very important as well. If I have 100 or let's say 100 user company, right? In Azure, especially with WVD, if I have 100 concurrent users, they all come in at 9 and leave at 5, that is going to be priced very differently than 50 concurrent users. That same 100 user company, but it's over 2 different shifts, right? And we need to understand that. Microsoft licensing is another big one. To stay compliant with Microsoft licensing, in case you get audited, we need to know not only what editions they have, but what other add-ons. And SQL is a great example. SQL, if they have software assurance and per core licensing on-prem, they can just bring that with them. There's no additional cost. Now, if they don't have software assurance, you have to relicense SQL in Azure to be compliant, right? So there's these types of things we need to understand, as well as 365, right? What edition do they have? Azure Active Directory is a major component of anything in Azure. And different editions, they might already have licensing that they need, they might not, so we need to understand that. And then with Nerdio, we can walk the tightrope that I like to talk about, and has always kind of been what I think we've been trying to achieve with IT over the years, is what is the average number of hours that your employees need to access their IT systems? Because what we can do is intelligently turn off machines when they're not needed, and then turn them on when they are. And you can kind of balance this with some other programs and really cost optimize in Azure, right? If you take a look at most of your customers, I'm willing to bet the vast majority are sleeping at 2 in the morning, right? They don't need to log into their systems at 5 a.m. on Sunday morning. So why pay for them if we have an option to have them maybe turned off, right? So those are all things that we'll address today in going through the pricing. One of the last things that I'll mention here in questions that you need to think about are peripheral devices, which I'm sure you're asking about. But I think this is even more important when we talk about moving to the cloud. The cloud can be really great, but as human beings, I find that a lot of end users, especially non-technical folks, it doesn't matter how great some new solution is, how much money it saves, how much better, faster, stronger it is. Humans don't like change, right? And we can't move printers into the cloud, right? We can't move scanners into the cloud. So we want to make sure our users are interacting with the technology that they need in a similar or as close to the same way as they're used to. So when we introduce this great new solution, we don't start getting pushback from people. Well, yeah, it saves us some money, but everybody's complaining because they have to do this differently, right? People don't like that. So those are important to understand how they will interact with that going forward. So now that I have kind of our foundation, right, our questions, things that we need to ask, I will pause right after I do the margin optimization review as well, if there are any questions. And you may have already heard about these things if you attended the previous sessions. We're fairly redundant with these across all of our presentations, always here at Nerdio, because these are absolutely critical in being successful with Azure. So number one, when we're doing pricing in Azure, we need to take into consideration our CSP, our discounts, rebates, and incentives from our cloud service provider partnership with Microsoft. Azure reserved instances, we need to be able to reserve compute, RAM, and CPU where it makes sense in Azure. This does a couple things. First of all, it gives me a big discount. And if you look at the average cost of an Azure environment, 68% of it comes from your compute. So if I can get a massive discount on the biggest component of that, I'm well ahead of the game. The other thing is it delivers this largest expenditure in Azure on a fixed fee. So it allows me to go resell Azure in a fixed fee as well. Leverage Azure hybrid benefit. In most cases, it's super expensive to rent your operating system license through your Azure subscription. It's actually going to be a lot cheaper to just buy it separately. Go buy your OS license for your servers through your CSP subscription. An average file server, which I'll show in a little bit, that we see a lot of people use in Azure, costs about $135, somewhere around there per month, just for the operating system. Where instead you can just buy it separately, not through renting through Azure monthly, buy it separately for about $250 for the whole year. If you have the option to pay $135 a month or $250 for a whole year, which are you going to pick? And then some shameless self-promotion here. Use auto-scaling, right? Turn off machines when they're not needed, turn them on when they are. And then lastly, automation via Nerdio, right? Just like you probably do with the rest of your business. You aren't going out there and touching every single endpoint to run updates and patches, right? Use automation. Why? Because it makes you more profitable. It gives you predictability and stability for your end customer. And that's exactly what Nerdio can do for the infrastructure component of Azure. So I'll pause real quick, see if anybody has any questions before I keep moving on.
I have one.
Yeah.
When you get the automatic turning off and turning on, what happens if a user does try to get into a resource on the cloud on Azure? If the machine is, let's say it is Sunday 5 a.m. and the client does need to jump on their system and do something? How does that look like?
So it's going to depend, but I would say generally, if they try and log in and you don't give them some type of administrator type access to turn those machines on, then they can't get in, right? There's no, for a typical SMB type of customer, there's no like automation where it recognizes that somebody's trying to log in and then lights up the environment. So it's very important to set proper expectations with your customers around this, saying, hey, we can save you some money here. We can get this really cheap, but if you want to work outside of these hours, right, then you're not going to be able to unless you contact us. And then we're obviously going to bill you, right? Because now I got to go on Saturday morning and light up the environment.
Okay, and is a simple, sometimes restricted admin user that can be created for the client to turn on their own machines, or it's going to be like a global admin or something crazy like that?
So you can actually give them access to the Nerdio portal. So our backend automation tool, you can create an administrator account for them in there, and you can brand it with your MSP information. So they don't ever see Nerdio. They log in, and it's really easy. You show them there's one section where the servers are, and there's a button that says start. So all they have to do is be able to go in and hit start if you want to do it that way. But I would say the most common way, if price isn't, you don't need to drop the prices absolutely dirt cheap as possible. What we can do is we can combine some of these programs, right? Some certain machines, I know I'm always going to want on, in most cases, my file server, Active Directory, that type of stuff. So we do reserved instances for some aspect of the environment. And then a subset of that same environment, we use auto scaling. And so we can mix and match, so you actually don't have to get into those expectations with the customers. They can always access it. Sure, it's going to be a little bit more expensive, but we're not talking, a crazy amount of money, maybe an extra $50 a month or something like that, or a few dollars per user per month. So it shouldn't blow your costs out of the water, but it also gives you that option to say, hey, if you truly only care about cost, I can get it really, really cheap, but you have to live within these limitations.
Thank you. Makes sense.
You're welcome. Great. So let's get to the part where everybody came here for, where it's time to price out an actual opportunity. You've probably seen the Azure pricing calculator. It's actually, in my opinion, I actually like the Azure pricing calculator, but I live and breathe Azure every single day. I've only recently started to like it because I can understand it maybe better because I've been doing this for a while now. When I started out, I could never use this thing accurately. It was horrible. The problem is there's too many options in here. And the other big thing from an MSP perspective is Microsoft doesn't care how you price it out. They care how you provision it. There's no checks and balances in the Azure pricing calculator. I constantly see people that go in, price something out, and you miss something. Well, you go provision it. Let's say you forgot to price out bandwidth. You've now sold your solution. You provision your customer. They're using bandwidth. You can't stop using bandwidth within Azure. Now your bill's higher than what you thought it was. You are now losing money as an MSP. So here's your, what are you going to do? You're either going to take the hit, or you have to have an uncomfortable conversation with your customer, say, hey, I need more money, I messed up. Right? Nobody wants that. What Nerdio has done is built out our own cost estimator. It hooks into the Azure pricing calculator. We're pulling all the exact same data, but we do that plus add in other data, things that are kind of required to have a complete solution, as well as checks and balances to make sure you don't get upside down in an opportunity. So that's why I highly recommend using this. It makes it very easy. I'm going to explain just about every single line item in our pricing calculator, and I will be done with it within 30 minutes from right now at the very most. If I don't explain every line item, you or I could price out an opportunity in about 5 minutes. And that's the key here. Azure might not be right for everybody, but we need to validate that. So the fact that you don't have this massive client acquisition cost, right, or a ton of heartburn because you got to go price out a couple Azure opportunities, you can just knock them out in a couple minutes, makes it really easy. So this pricing calculator can be found on our website, getnerdio.com. In the top right corner of the main page, there's a publicly accessible version of it right there, and it will look identical to this. Now, what I've done is I've taken those qualifying questions I gave you at the beginning. I've gotten them answered for actual real prospect from one of our partners, and I've lined them up with each section within our pricing tool. So the idea here is you can go get those qualifying questions answered and then just match them up just like I am here, fill out your pricing, and you're good to go. And I'm going to do this in a fixed fee in this example as well. So when I open up the cost estimator, I have these 3 big blue boxes. These refer to the Nerdio license that you want to use. So IT as a service is Nerdio for Azure Enterprise. It's our full-featured, all the Nerdio automation you can imagine for a SMB, which we would define as about 300 users or less. This is designed for an environment that has both desktops and servers. So RDS or WVD plus a server environment. I would say don't pay attention to this desktop as a service option. It is a stripped down version of our automation. You lose a bunch of features, and for the couple bucks per user per month you save, really not worth it in my opinion. You may use this IaaS option though. This is for an environment that has no desktops. So you want to bring your customer into Azure with just a domain controller and a file server. That's where you will use this case. And really, it's kind of identical to the IT as a service, except you don't have any of the desktop options. Section 2. So this is where we start filling out the questions. Pretty straightforward. This isn't rocket science here, right? How many users do you have? You fill that out, and how many desktops that you need, right? We only want to pay attention to the number of users that will have desktops. If this was a 50-user environment, only 27 needed desktops and the rest were email only, I would still do 27 right here. This is going to make sure that we're accounting for the correct resources in Azure as well as the Nerdio licenses. And this is important. We're pre-populating some fields already by filling in this one box, right? We have bandwidth, we have storage IO, we have some server recommendations that are all pre-populating down below. So really important to do this. You choose your desktop experience. Since I chose desktop in this case, I'm going to do Windows Virtual Desktop, but you could do terminal services. Dedicated personal desktops, not really common, but that is a 1-to-1 ratio. A dedicated VM hosting a dedicated user's individual desktop. Now that's a good case where maybe I'm going to turn off the whole environment at night, but the CEO, they want to work weird hours, right? Maybe I'll give that CEO a dedicated desktop and they could actually light that up. So there's some kind of different customizations you can do as well. And then lastly here, does anybody need graphic intensive programs? I get asked about this a lot. I have partners that are doing 100-user environments, larger even, and some smaller ones, that they need AutoCAD, they need Revit, right? They need to do Teams. Like all of those things are available within Azure at this point. And in this example, they didn't need any. So everybody's going to be session-based. Even though I'm session-based, all I'm sharing really are RAM and CPU. I still have my own Windows 10 desktop, my own apps, my own shortcuts, my own background. So from a user experience, right, it still looks and feels like my own individual desktop, but it helps keep your costs low. Concurrent users, kind of a standard company, right? Everybody comes in the morning, they leave in the afternoon, but this is important to know as well as their user behavior for the last part of that section 2. We need to figure out the density. How many users per CPU core? So I can make sure I have enough resources for my users to be able to do everything that they need to, right? And in some ways, we're kind of making educated guesses here. So we always want to, especially if we're going to deliver a fixed fee, overestimate this. And I'll give you my guidance. And I've done thousands of these environments so far in the past year with just WVD. So these are Microsoft terminology. A professional worker means 3 users per CPU core. That is what they say the average is. And in my experience, it is not the average. It is a little bit too light. To me, 3 users per core is somebody that needs 1 line of business app like QuickBooks. They use Microsoft Office and they have a few tabs of their favorite web browser open. They're not doing Team or Zoom meetings. They don't have 30 tabs open. They don't have a whole bunch of different line of business applications open. And that'll fit with those small customers. Right, that 3-5 user customer, a lot of them fall in there. They just need hosted QuickBooks or something like that. So that's great. But as you start going larger, you'll generally see, well, we have a couple line of business apps. Yeah, most people have 10 or 15 tabs at Chrome open, and you know, people want to occasionally do a Teams meeting with their video up. In that case, they're probably going to be what I notice is the average 2 users per CPU core. A power worker would be somebody that needs to consistently run video. somebody that needs a whole bunch of tabs open of their favorite web browser, those types of things. And so in this case, with this response that I got from the customer, they kind of fall in that kind of average range that I see. So I'm going to hit custom and do 2. And what Nerdio is doing is all the math for you. All right, you have 27 users. Whatever machine we pick later to host the desktops, it'll have a certain number of CPU cores. So we'll do the math and tell you how many of those you need to achieve that. And so this kind of takes that guesswork out of it, but this is really important. You can, I would also play around with this. You know, as you get started, I like to do one user per CPU core, right? Account for those extra resources. I'm giving a fixed fee here, but you'll notice, you know, your price is obviously going to be higher. So is that going to price me out of this, right? And allows you to have that kind of conversation with your customer. You really kind of have to be that consultant here, talking with them. Well, what are you going to do? What are your expectations around this, right? Those types of things. So from here, we go into the server section and we start filling out our actual VMs. What instance size am I going to use and customizing that, just like the Azure pricing calculator. You click instance size, drop it down, grab whatever machine you need, and you're good. OS disk, those usually stay at 128 standard SSD. It'd be rare you need something else. And then you'll click the same drop down for your data disk and choose the VM type that you want for Azure. Easy. You guys are probably, some of you scratching your head though, like, yeah, okay, but that's why I'm here. Like, how do I know which machine to pick, right? How do I know what's going to be best served for my customer, right? And yeah, it's easy to click a drop down, but why would I use an M or a B or a D machine in Azure, right? And so before I fill it out for this customer, I've actually built a cheat sheet. So if you only know these 4 machine types in Azure, you're going to cover 95+% of environments that you deal with. I maybe need to use a different machine out of these 4 once every couple months. And I help partners with maybe 10 to 20 of these quotes every single day. So it's very rare that you need to know something else. Just pay attention to these. B series, B stands for burstable. They're intended for light workloads without constant use. Active Directory or domain controller is a great example of this. It sits at idle, and then people authenticate and it bursts up, people are using it, and then it goes back down to idle, right? Great example. B series, you want to use them where you can because they're cheap, they're really inexpensive. So like this B2MS that I might use for a domain controller, it's something like $26 a month, right? So for this 27 user environment, I'm $1 a user a month for a VM in Azure. That's pretty good price, right? D series, these are your workhorse, everyday kind of normal machine in Azure. We see them commonly for file servers, app servers. There's no burstable, right? You can use the full capacity of the machine. It's the most common. E series, they are identical to these D series, except you have a higher ratio of RAM to CPU. That's the only difference. They're intended for high memory usage workloads. SQL, desktop hosts, right? Users tend to consume a lot more RAM than they do CPU. And then the last one are N series. These are GPU enabled machines. They have you know, the GPU cards in them, people that are doing Revit and AutoCAD. So that's all you have to know, right? Don't pay attention to any other machine type. And then, well, before I say this, I'm going to give you my big disclaimer that you can see on the screen here. These are averages that we see at Nerdio. If you just blindly follow this, you're going to underspec and underquote some environments. You'll overspec and overquote other ones. But it's nice to have a guide, right? I get we can't always live in a perfect world where we can fully assess every environment. And you also kind of want to have that place where it's like, all right, I think I'm doing the right thing, but am I really sure about this? So you can kind of use this in conjunction with gathering the correct information. So I have a great question from Chris. How hard is it to change hardware specs? If you undersize, can you easily upgrade? If you're using Nerdio, it's really easy. It's literally 3 clicks. You log into your portal, you find the machine, let's say your file server. You say, I want to change the size of it. You click a button, you choose the new machine size and hit OK. That's it. There's no reimaging. There's no sysprep. There's no, any of that type of stuff. Is
there a reboot required?
There is a reboot. Yep, there is a reboot required. So you'll want to do it after hours. If people are actually logged in and using it.
Thank you.
You're welcome. But yeah, it's really, really easy to do, to change it out. But again, I try and avoid getting into situations where I have to go back and ask for more money or make changes. I set that expectation, right? Hey, we're moving into this new world of Azure. We might have some type of dialing in period. So sometimes we find we overspec it and it will actually be cheaper than we thought. Other times, we find we underspec it, it might cost a little bit more. So I always aim to kind of over quote or over provision this. It should never be so much. Azure can be cheap enough where when we do this, we're not talking crazy amount of dollars, right? A couple bucks a user a month, and you're probably not going to lose a deal over that. But again, these are our averages. So in this case, we're pricing out a 27 user environment. I'll probably use a B2MS for domain controller. I'll probably use a D4 SV3 for my file server with a premium disk. And my WVD, my desktop pool, I'll probably be somewhere between an E16 or 2 E16s. And I say that because I'm right on the border here. 2 E16s, that's like, double, almost double, right, what I would actually need. I want this to be a competitive price as well. So just keep all of this in mind, and let's hop back into filling this out and validating this stuff based on the questions that I got answered from my end customer. So we have our server list here. They have Active Directory, no clue what they have in terms of RAM and CPU, but I know from the averages, right, B2MS. So I feel pretty good about that. It's only 27 users, and Nerdio generally sees this work for up to 40. They have file print in QuickBooks, 4 cores, 8 gigs of memory. Now, based on our averages, we would see the D4 SV3, which is 4 cores, 16 gigs of memory. This customer hasn't told me that they have any performance issues here. It's just old equipment that needs to be replaced. So I actually have newer gear and more resources than what they have today. So I feel really good about that. SQL, 2 cores, 16 gigs of memory. So there actually is a machine with 2 cores, 16 gigs of memory available in Azure. Here's what I recommend doing, again, to kind of protect yourself as you're getting going and be able to deliver a fixed fee. Price that out, and then choose a bigger machine. See what the cost difference is. Now, there's a little box in our cost estimator. It's constantly updating the price as you make changes. I did that in here. It was like $1.50 per user per month that it increased the cost to jump up to this slightly larger machine. So I'm going to price it out and base my margin and everything off the slightly larger machine. It wasn't enough to change the price where I feel like I'm going to lose this deal, right? But what this does for me is if the customer comes back after they go live and they're like, performance isn't all that great, say, hey, no problem. I'm going to give you a bigger machine. I'm going to give you more resources. That's a huge win for my customer because I've kind of preempted that, right? I don't have to say, well, it's going to cost a little bit more. Let me see if I can, maybe erode my margin a little bit, right? It's a non-issue. We're talking $1 a user a month, right? Not that big of a deal. I don't see any crazy applications in here that would tell me, hey, I need even more resources, in the environment, nothing super heavy. SQL, they're running SQL Express, so I'm really not worried about that again. And I don't have to worry about the licensing since that's free. Storage. Here's a big one, and I'm going to try and keep this as simple as possible. But number one, file server, you always want a premium SSD if you're doing Windows Virtual Desktop. The user profile orchestration, FS Logics, actually sits on this data disk. So this is orchestrating and this is carving up all of my virtual hard drives for each of my users. So I need a lot of IOPS for that. And that's what the premium SSD will allow for. So that's why you always want to do that. I can just about guarantee if you provision on a standard SSD, you will be wanting to switch that out very, very quickly. So just don't even mess around with that. Always do premium. But the other thing is I need to account for that VHD file size for each user's desktop on this. They have 1.2 terabytes today. The average VHD file that we usually see is about 20 gigs per user. The max that we really see is about 30 gigs per user. So I'm going to roll the dice a little bit here. I'm going to do 20 gigs times my 27 users, and I'll add it to the 1.2 terabytes, gets me just about 17 or 1.7 terabytes. So I need to choose the next drive up, which was a 2 terabyte drive, and give them a little bit of room. So there's a number of different ways you can do this. You can split out the drives, right? Put the VHDs on one, put their storage on another, a whole bunch of different ways. But I like just keeping it simple and doing it all here. Ultimately, again, I'm potentially over-speccing this. I can put the VHDs on a premium and then attach a smaller drive that's on standard SSD that's cheaper, right, for their actual files. So there's a bunch of ways I can do it, but I like over-speccing it a little bit here. SQL is under 300 gigs. I did a 256 drive, and again, I chose premium because it's SQL Express. I probably don't need that performance, so I'm going to provision on a standard SSD. But again, I'm pricing it out on premium. I run into performance issues and it becomes IOPS, no problem. I just click the button in the Nerdio portal and it switches out the drive for me. Very easy to do, and I've already priced it out. And if I don't need it, it's a little bit of extra margin in my pocket. That's great. And then lastly, we have our desktops. So what I did was I changed this to an E8. Now, I have two of them here. We're doing the math, right? Nerdio does all the math based on the user to CPU core ratio. And I want to use auto scaling to keep the price down. So instead of a single E16, I'm going to use two E8s, same amount of horsepower. This customer works 40 hours per week. I don't trust my customer. I'm providing a fixed fee, so I need to overestimate. I'm going to overestimate and say 50 hours. I feel pretty good about this. This is kind of like the stock market. If you watch your portfolio every single day, you're going to rip all your hair out and drive yourself nuts. You look at it over the course of 3 months, 6 months, or a year, it all kind of averages out, right? And it's always kind of got this trajectory. Same with these things in Azure, right? Over the course of a year, they're probably going to average out, right around that 40, 45 hours, 42 hours. But if I look at it every single month, I'm going to drive myself crazy. And that's what the statement means. So to the question before about auto scaling and users being able to log in, what I'm going to do with this environment is I'm going to buy reserved instances for all of these machines and leave them always on. So I'm going to take my discount, right, and just leave it on so I don't need to mess with the customer and worry about them logging in after hours. And then for the desktops, I'm going to leave one of these two machines always on. So when somebody needs to log in at night or the weekends, they can. There's a machine there. The second machine, for when all the users are in 40 hours a week in the middle of the day, that will only light up for 50 hours per week, right? So my minimum size is one always on, and my other one is a pay-as-you-go, or that machine just turns on or off as it's needed. So we can kind of combine those programs so I don't have to worry about turning things on in the middle of the night or my customer needing to work outside of those hours. 365, the customer currently has business standard. They need Windows 10 Enterprise to be able to use Windows Virtual Desktop. So you can actually price it all out right here. You can't do that in the Azure pricing calculator. You're going to do all these different portals. So I'm going to check off 365 Business Premium. This includes my Office apps as well as my Windows 10 license. And I'm going to sell them 27 licenses, one for each user. I will tell them, hey, my new quote, that actually is going to replace everything that you pay today, right? So whatever you're paying for Office licensing goes away, and I'm going to just bundle it all in with this. If you wanted to kind of mix and match or sell some other licenses for different users, you can do that here as well as SQL, even though it's not needed in this case, so I won't check that off. The next section, section 5, is where we have to remember those margin optimization strategies. By default, we have this set as no for hybrid benefit because you need to supply the Windows licenses for compliance if you do choose yes. So that's what we defaulted. But what I would recommend every single time is click it, change it. I'm going to buy the license, and I'm going to buy either a 12-month or a 36-month license. And what our calculator does is you'll notice very quickly that the cost per user per month is going to drop because we're not renting the license on a monthly basis anymore. And then you'll see a new line item pop up that says this is the cost of the license one time up front. So we have all of that intelligence built in, and you can play around with that and see what makes most sense for your customer. But generally, it's always going to be way less expensive to go ahead and buy this license separately. Next, you have reserved instances. We default to 3 years because it'd be a very rare situation where it would not make sense to do the reservation. On the last page, we'll also show you the early termination penalty. I've done the math, and I'm happy to talk offline with anybody. I'll run through the numbers for RIs with you anytime. But as long as your customer stays on for about 3 to 6 months, it's actually cheaper to pay the penalty and cancel the reserved instance early than it is to guaranteed pay the higher monthly rate of a pay-as-you-go. And a lot of our partners, what they do in their contracts are things like, hey, this is a month-to-month agreement, but if you cancel within 3 years, there's an early termination penalty, right? And so that way you can kind of be competitive with other MSPs who maybe are offering kind of true month-to-month agreements. Your customer is on the hook for paying that early termination fee. I have other ones that maybe get creative. They don't, a lot of them don't even tell people that they're doing the reserved instance, but they might charge a little bit extra for the migration, an extra $500 or something. And that can kind of cover that early termination penalty if it comes in. The early termination penalty is tiny though. It's really not usually that big of a deal unless we're talking, environment of a couple hundred users or something like that. Next, we have backup. Most customers will need backup. Check off yes. That counts for full image snapshots of the whole environment using Azure Backup. It's not something third party. Everything is replicated across 3 separate data centers. So it's usually more than robust enough. I got to update this slide too. There's a hyperlink right here where my cursor is moving in the current version of the pricing calculator. If you click that, you can build out or customize your backup retention policy. So make sure you check that because the default is just 30 end of days. Most customers, you're going to want an annual backup, monthlies, that type of stuff. So definitely build that out. For this customer, backup's not super important and they're not under any compliance. So I don't need out of region DR. This is kind of protecting against an entire Azure region going down, which would be extremely rare. And I probably have bigger concerns about other things going on in the world if that were to happen. So I'm going to say no for this. Some partners, though, they'll price this out at no. Then they'll go back in, click off yes. They'll figure out the difference. And then you can say, hey, if you need out of region DR, it's a bolt-on, right? For an extra however much per month. So very easy to do by just checking the box. So they do printing and scanning. I have some peripherals here. So I'm going to check off yes for a VPN. Do I actually need it? Maybe not. The WVD client passes through scanners, webcams, printers, all of that stuff really, really well. I sold RDS for years and it was always horrible. But with WVD, it works very well. So I might not need it. But I checked off yes and I said, it was about $1 a user a month to say yes. So again, that's not going to price me out of it. I'd rather have it in here in my pricing. And if I don't use it, then great, I make an extra $27 a month. Wasn't that big of a deal from a pricing perspective. The other thing is I'm probably going to need my VPN for the first 30 days because I'm going to hook this up to their existing environment to do a data transfer. And so at least I know I'll need it at least for the first 30 days. So I might as well price it out.
Is this going to include, you're talking about site to site, but it's priced per user. So is that site to site? Or is that like a VPN client environment?
It's a site to site. It's not a client VPN. It does support client VPN though. If you look it up or do any searching, it's Azure's basic VPN. It allows for up to 10 site to sites. I believe it's like 25 client VPNs and it's 100 megs of throughput. So that's what this is pricing out. What our calculator does.
Sorry, those are numbers, what, per month? Like 100 meg?
No, it's just 100 megs of throughput. So like if I had.
Oh, throughput, okay.
Yeah, throughput.
Okay, so if a client has multiple locations or multiple people working from home and they do want to have that site to site from their router at home or their sub office to Azure, is that 10 per user? Is that 10 per client?
10 per client. So if they had 10 offices, let's say, then if you click yes here, you're going to have enough site to sites for all of them. What I generally find though is, especially if we're talking WVD, you don't need the VPN. Microsoft gives you that gateway server for free. So, as an MSP, I don't want to manage all these different VPNs. That just increases my labor costs and everything. I may want it so they can print in the office, right? When they're working remote. So generally we find that basic VPN is okay. If you need something with more throughput, a greater number of VPNs, there are tons of options in Azure for that we can help you out with as well in terms of pricing out. The next one up, I think it gives you 650 megs of throughput and I think 25 VPNs. It adds another like $125 a month. We show the pricing as per user per month in here, but from Azure, it's actually going to be like a total. It's not based on per user.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. These next options are not very common, so I'm going to fly through them. Desktop auto scale is if you do dedicated personal desktops and you don't do reserved instances. I don't meet those conditions, so it's grayed out. On-ramp regions is if you have a geographically dispersed customer. We can actually help you through our automation put certain aspects of the environment in one Azure region and then other aspects of the environment in a separate region. You'll want to use this for great performance. I just worked with an MSP. They had a CPA customer of theirs in Texas, but they also outsourced a bunch of their CPA work to a company in India. So we use this, right? They deployed the main environment in South Central US, and then they put the desktops for the employees in India in an India region to lower the latency for those users, because they were actually using RDS before, all in the US, and had horrible performance. So kind of nice. If you get into that situation, just reach out. We'll help you out with it. And we do plan to move all on-prem infrastructure into Azure, except for peripherals. So we don't need hybrid AD. This is less common. Definitely talk to us if you're interested in this. But we can price out and help you with an environment where not everything's going to move to Azure, right? They have a SQL server they just bought. We're not going to move that out to Azure and pay for it twice, right? They need to get their value out of it. So I want users in their desktop in Azure to access that SQL database that's staying on-prem. If you're in a situation like that, that's where you'll do hybrid AD. You'll connect the two environments so they're unified. All right, so we're getting to the end here. We got bandwidth. Users consume about $1. We default to $1.50. If you don't trust us, bump that up a little bit. Bandwidth is a big misconception that it's expensive. It's actually really cheap in Azure. And just like the auto scaling, it's going to average out over the year. Sure, some months you'll be a couple pennies more. Most months you'll be less. And again, you'll average out. Storage IO, always leave that. It doesn't apply to premium SSD, but I have a mix in here, so that's why I'm going to leave that of premium and standard. Personal desktops, if you do choose that, we default to a tiny machine. So just make sure you up that if you need to. You'll probably need more resources than that, more than 1 core and 3.5 gigs of memory. Plug in your CSP discount percentages. This is how you see your true MSP costs, right? We can never figure out what our actual margins are and accurately price things out if we don't know what our true cost is. So you plug all of that in here, choose your region, and choose your currency. From there, we're done, right? I just explained every single line item, and I think I hit the 30 minutes that I promised. From there, you're going to get an actual price, $63 per user per month. So if you think about that, in my opinion, in my experience being at an MSP and selling cloud for a number of years, not too bad, right? I have all of their infrastructure, all of their storage, all of their backups, all of their 365 licensing. The only thing this is missing is my managed services, right? At 63 per user per month. So we total up the individual line items here on the right of the pie graph, Azure, 365, and Nerdio, so nothing's missing there. I get my total per month. And then AHB, this is buying those operating system licenses so I can save a lot of money. We show you the cost for that as well, 1164. So now I'm done, right? I've priced out my environment. And again, remember, I've overpriced this. I went above and beyond what I think they will actually need. So there should be a little bit of extra money in here, wiggle room for me. So what do you do now? Well, in the next presentation, we're going to talk you through much more in depth on how to do that. But what I like to do and what I've done for years is kind of this methodology. I take that $63 per user per month, and then I add in my normal managed service stack, my help desk cost, my ID agent or RMM and AV, whatever's in your stack, right? I know that might be different for everybody here, but you add all of that stuff and you get a total cost. And then you add your gross margin. And in this case, by doing a 45% gross margin, I have $185 per user per month. Now, some of you may be shaking your head like, Will, like, give me a break. I don't get out of bed for anything less than 55%, right? You know, or something like that. And I get it. You guys can add whatever margin you want. But one thing, if you follow this methodology, that I think you have to maybe change your way of thinking a little bit. Because when I added this 45% gross margin, I added it to everything, which includes their infrastructure. It includes Office 365 and it includes Nerdio. My guess is you're not getting that margin percentage on infrastructure or 365 today. So my overall profitability on this customer as a whole is actually higher, potentially higher than what it is if they were just a managed service customer with everything on-prem.
But Will, you're not counting any labor cost anywhere in here, right?
So I have the help desk cost, which is kind of where I'm blending in my labor. So yeah, that's your like 8x5 support, right? And yours might be higher, lower, or whatever.
So you're counting for half an hour per person for help desk per month, roughly.
Exactly. Yeah, and I mean, I got some partners that maybe that would say $50, right, or whatever it is.
Yeah, no, that's you're not. I wouldn't say you're grossly off there if you're just talking the help desk piece. You're not including anything for infrastructure, but there's less infrastructure. You're not including any on-site, but the goal is not to have any on-site. So we can debate this a lot, right? But when I look at this, and I talk pricing an awful lot with our peer group members, I look at this. I was right with you at the 45%. My first thought was you're a little low, and I immediately went to what you just qualified as, well, wait a minute. No one's getting 45% on pass-through services, right?
Yep, exactly. And you don't there's no right way to do it. But for me, from a sales perspective, right, I like going to my customer and saying, hey, $185 per user per month, we give you everything. You get IT in a box, right? Maybe this doesn't cover on-site support. So, okay, that's time materials, but how often do you need that, right? And so you can build that out. And in the next session, we're going to talk about how to build different packages. So I might say no on-site support included is $185. With unlimited on-site support is $205, right? And you can have your different levels, and it makes it very easy to do that.
Absolutely. No, great job. Bates asked about bringing your own SPLA licenses into this.
So SPLA is not compatible with Azure, right? You're not the service provider. You don't own the equipment, so it switches all to CSP. So that's the program you'll use. CSP licensing is very comparable to SPLA, though, in some cases less expensive.
Great.
Thank you.
Any other questions, anybody? This was so perfect. There's no questions. You guys got your pricing down. Those that have said frequently, it's too expensive, I can't do this. When you look at this right now in front of you, do you feel a little differently? Chris and Bates, I'll ask you because you're on camera. Both Bills, Bill Mack and Bill Mulcahy. I'm asking the people that are peer group members because I can. Any thoughts?
My challenge is to dissolve our data center equipment that we invested so much time and money in. But the reason why I'm here is because our insurance carrier is TechRug is pushing us to remove the liability of owning the equipment and hosting everything for our client. So I would add another line item actually to the cost calculator here. In my head, at least, the cost of removing the liability, some of the liability off of my shoulders, owning the equipment and protecting something in my own data center is another
I think that
cost.
would reduce this number, not raise it, right, Bates?
No, correct. Yeah, I mean, I can sell it for more, or I can make more profit for the same price because my insurance is going to be lower and my expenses are going to be lower to maintaining our own equipment. So
I think that comes into play when you pick your margin. But when you look at this number and you look at and Will did a good job of coming up with a number that is not totally unreasonable as a per seat number for most of you. It might not be what you're charging today, but it's not a totally unreasonable number. And that's the part I want you to hone in on here, right? And Bates, your challenge of getting out of your data center is more of a cash flow challenge to the business than it is something that comes into play here. You've stated it as a positive, not a negative, so I like that too. Right.
Yeah. I have a question though. How do we get the total cost in this calculation is 103 and you're adding 45%? How is that 185? What did I miss there? In this example, of course, I know numbers will change obviously for every case.
Yeah, so I added gross margin, not markup, and I just went to a online gross margin calculator, so I'm assuming that was accurate.
Got it. Thank you. It's confusing in my head.
Yeah, I know most MSPs, they at least the ones that I've worked with, they focus on gross margin versus like markup or regular margin. That's the more important number. So I try and make this as realistic as possible. I don't want you guys thinking I'm like making up numbers or anything like that. And the one other thing that I will say is with this, I got MSP partners that are selling the same exact package for, I've seen it go for $325 per user. I've seen like people be able to command that with this type of solution. Now, I also have partners that sell the same thing for $100 a user, right? So you got to evaluate what makes sense for you, where your margins actually end up. But I can 100% tell you, it is possible to go out there and sell this solution for $300 a user a month, right? Maybe you know, you have to change some other things in your sales process. You maybe have to get confidence with it, right? But it is possible.
And I think we're going to hear a little bit about that on the next session as well, right? For those that have hung on for 3 sessions or the last 2, unless your schedule doesn't permit it, this next one's interesting because we're going to hear from somebody that's done it, that actually did this to a level that caused his MSP to be worth a lot more money than many would have thought it was worth, so much so that he sold it and focuses full-time on Nerdio now, right? So, I think it's an interesting, I'm looking forward to this one as well. You guys all have the link for the 4th session. Will, fantastic job. Does anyone else have any last questions?
No, just a comment that calculation based on margin. So it's divide by 0.55 for 45% margin, and it comes out at $187.
There you go.
Yep.
That's where that number came from. So I agree. That's and you're absolutely right, Will. We try to deal with margin more than markup. Markup ends up being almost like a hypothetical number, theoretical, but margin talks real money.
Markup is fool's gold to most people.
Yeah, there you go. That's right, Scott.
You know,
Steve,
exactly.
Yeah, that's right.
Those that are in MSP-Ignite peer group members, we always talk margin, right?
Yeah.
That's
good.
what we always look at. So Will, great job. I really appreciate it. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording so that